I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to discuss how we can make federal real estate work for the American taxpayer. At the beginning of last Congress, this subcommittee hosted a roundtable with industry stakeholders to help members better understand current market trends in office space and how to right-size the federal real estate portfolio. Building on that roundtable, this subcommittee held a hearing that highlighted a report published by the Government Accountability Office on the use of space for federal agencies in their headquarters buildings. The information that GAO uncovered in this report was shocking. While many federal workers' workspace was underused, I don't think any of us expected to see just how devastating the usage numbers are. GAO found that a majority of the agencies reviewed used 25% or less of their headquarters building space. In the case of some agencies, the utilization rate was closer to 9%. Let that number sink in, 9%. Even under the Trump administration's return to the office directives, we know there will be unused space because in the same report, at least one agency admitted that even if 100% of their employees returned to the office, 33% of their space would still be empty. As Mr. Marroni has testified in previous hearings, the federal government spends $2 billion a year to operate and maintain federal office buildings, regardless of whether the building is being used. This means that American taxpayers are literally paying billions for federal office space just to sit empty. In response to the findings from GAO, subcommittee members put forward a slate of bills to improve the use of office space, increase the transparency, and hold agencies accountable. Two key pieces of legislation enacted included, first, the Use It Act, which sets targets for space usage, requires deployment of technology to count actual employees using government space, and establishes timelines, meaning if agencies don't use their space, they'll lose it. Secondly, the FASTA Reform Act strengthens the authority of the Public Buildings Reform Board to identify federal properties that should be sold. On January 5th, 2025, these reforms and others put forth by committee members became law as part of the Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, of 2024. With some deadlines in those reforms approaching quickly, I look forward to working with GSA, OMB, and the Public Buildings Reform Board on WRDA implementation. I am pleased that Trump administration hit the ground running by identifying the waste in federal real estate and promptly taking action to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not wasted on empty buildings. This is not a partisan issue. Even the mayor of Washington, D.C. has highlighted the negative impact of empty federal offices on the local economy here in D.C. American taxpayers expect Congress to hold the federal government accountable for all of its wasteful spending, and I look forward to working with the Trump administration to achieve results for our constituents. Getting a handle on waste in federal real estate can save the taxpayers billions of dollars annually. Members of both parties should be supportive of this goal. I now recognize Ranking Member, Honorable Mr. Statton, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And before I talk about the issue at hand, I just want to speak on behalf of all members of Congress that are present. We lost a colleague last night. Our colleague, Sylvester Turner, brand new Congress member representing Houston, the former mayor of Houston, and then before that, a member of the state legislature, sadly passed away after the State of the Union. And I've known him for many, many years as a former mayor myself. In fact, he and I had a chance to work together when Houston hosted the Final Four, and then Phoenix was the next city to host the Final Four the next year. So he trained me up, if you will, on how to be a good host for the Final Four. He is a legend of public service in Texas, and we are glad to have the time that we had with him here in the United States Congress. We offer our condolences to his family and to all of the people of Houston. We will miss him. Today we're here to talk about the General Services Administration's Public Building Service. GSA is the agency in charge of managing government buildings, essentially the federal government's real estate agent. Now, many public buildings are underutilized. That is a sentiment shared by both Republican and Democratic administrations in the past. But rather than going through a proper channels to measure building utilization, the Trump administration moved straight to the lease termination and building disposal stage, announcing plans to dispose of more than 400 buildings and terminate 2,500 leases, more than half of the GSA's real estate portfolio. To be clear, this Congress, in a bipartisan way, agrees that we need improved efficiency. In fact, as the chair mentioned, the 2024 Water Resources Development Act, which was signed into law by President Biden in January, directed GSA, the Office of Management and Budget, and federal agencies to measure building utilization over a 2-month period and dispose of space if utilization was below 60%. There is a logical and orderly way to do this, but the Trump administration clearly has no intention of following the word of directive. Instead, there has been mass confusion. Landlords are getting termination letters that their tenants know nothing about. Parties in the middle of lease negotiations don't know what to do. These space disposals are happening at the same time President Trump has mandated a return to work for all federal employees. At the same time that they're making mass layoffs among federal employees, this appears to be a policy at war with itself. Federal employees are returning to offices that are being disposed of. Landlords are getting termination notices for leases that are still in the firm term period. Constituents are concerned that they will not have access to VA health centers, Social Security field offices, or customer service for IRS needs if they want to do anything face-to-face. All of this is happening, and the GSA staff can't or won't communicate. In fact, to get information, we've had to rely on word of mouth from federal employees and reports on the DOGE website, which lists hundreds of lease terminations, Social Security offices, VA offices, and IRS offices while we're in the swing of tax season. In my home state of Arizona, the list includes the Small Business Administration, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Railroad Retirement Board, the Forest Services Supervisor's Office, the entity that processes permits and disseminates information for the entirety of the Tonto National Forest northeast of my district, the largest national forest in our state. The forest building is an important hub for monitoring Tonto. If this building is shuttered, we don't know where this work will be done. It is a concern for those of us as we enter the fire season in the state of Arizona. The loss of those buildings can have implications. With the loss of the supervisor's office, this could mean problems for communication and coordination for wildfire response in our national forest. As you can tell, I have a lot of questions about all of this. And a few weeks ago, I met with the GSA's new Commissioner of Public Buildings, Mike Peters, who was leading the Trump administration's federal real estate right-sizing efforts. Commissioner Peters, at that meeting with me, accepted an invitation to participate in this hearing, and for some reason, we don't know why, he has changed his mind and he is not present today. I don't understand. We need to provide oversight over this process. Commissioner Peters has a responsibility to be here to explain this to Congress so that we can provide our appropriate oversight duties. Instead of asking Commissioner Peters my questions, I will pose my questions to the two witnesses who are here today, and thank you for being here. Dave Winstead from the Public Buildings Reform Board and David Marroni from the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Marroni, thank you for testifying before the subcommittee and sharing your research and knowledge of federal real estate. I admire your fortitude. Mr. Winstead, thank you for your public service on the Public Buildings Reform Board, and I look forward to hearing how the board identifies underutilized federal assets and how the process of recommending disposals to GSA and OMB can be improved upon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Larson, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations. You have now two chairmanships on this.
I'm telling you.
Congratulations. I want to thank Ranking Member Stanton as well, and thank you for holding this timely hearing on the state of the federal real estate. So recent administration actions to reduce both telework and the federal real estate footprint have created confusion and upheaval within the federal real estate landscape. And the proposed changes have the potential to have a negative impact on the workforce, on communities where the workforce lives, the private sector landlords, and on construction contractors. Now, the GSA owns 1,500 buildings and has about 7,500 private sector leases. And according to press reports, the administration plans to reduce GSA's owned and leased portfolio by 50%. In justifying this push for property disposals, GSA's new Public Buildings Commissioners pointed to, quote, guidance from the 2024 WRDA bill, which many of us worked on. But WRDA did not direct the GSA to jump immediately to large-scale disposals. The WRDA bill directed GSA and OMB to work with agencies to measure building occupancy over a 2-month period before making any recommendations for space disposals. Congress gave GSA steps 1 through 5, but GSA is skipping from step 1 directly to step 5. That is causing confusion and chaos in the federal real estate market. The lease terminations are happening quickly, and at the same time as there's a return to office mandate, as well as the firings, as well as the RIFs. But how can an agency know how much space they require if they don't know how many employees they will have? The only certainty we have is a certain lack of clarity from the administration. These actions are reckless and potentially very costly for taxpayers. For example, last week, the National Transportation Safety Board was notified that its lease was going to be terminated in 4 months. It's my understanding, although we don't have any proof of this in writing, it's my understanding the termination decision has now been reversed. It is fortunate that the NTSB was not put in this position of having only 4 months to move not just their offices, but their laboratory space, while also investigating 1,195 transportation accidents and incidents at the same time, including the recent mid-air collision near Reagan National Airport. After consistently declining to provide staff with information about building disposals, late yesterday, GSA shared a list of 400 plus, quote, non-core assets being considered for divestment from government ownership. The list included the Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA, headquarters and building in Portland. And many utilities in Washington State and throughout the Pacific Northwest, including the largest public utility in my district, get large amounts of their power from their BPA system. The selling the building would be very disruptive to BPA's operations and therefore to ratepayers throughout the Pacific Northwest, especially disruptive to all the employees who have been ordered to return to work, to work in the office, which is fine, and I support that they do that, but they need a place to go to. Now, BPA leases the building from the GSA and pays for the lease with ratepayer money, not taxpayer money. I pay for the lease space at BPA because I pay rates to my public utility district. I don't think anyone else in this room does that. Selling this building would not lead to taxpayer savings from the BPA budget. People are confused about GSA's activities, and Congress has little visibility into what exactly GSA is doing, and I don't know if GSA knows what it is doing. My own staff is largely getting news of GSA activities from the press, from a Reddit thread titled GSA RIF Megathread. You'll never hear me say that again. And occasionally from ex-GSA employees. One building owner was told that GSA was terminating a lease, but because that lease was still in its because the lease was still in its firm term, GSA was obligated to pay for the space until 2029. GSA's actions have led to confusion amongst the project managers, general contractors, and engineers who are working on construction projects for GSA's public building service. GSA recently rescinded the P100 facility standards, which established the design, architecture, engineering, fire protection, historic preservation, and performance requirements for new buildings and major repair and alteration projects. How does this rescission of the design standards impact construction and renovation projects? Do they need to be redesigned? Do contracts need to be redrafted? Delay and risk are challenging for contractors and expensive for the government and therefore for taxpayers. And on January 24th, GSA paused all acquisitions and lease activities, including the National Deep Energy Retrofit Program. And according to one publicly traded energy company, the current NDER pause may have detrimental impacts on projects currently in construction, We, that is this company, have spent substantial sums on project design, engineering, material procurement, and employee hiring. A prolonged pause of these projects will negatively impact business investment and chill business certainty. So I too am disappointed that Mr. Peters is not with us today, but I do have some questions that we are sending to him. If agency headcounts are in flux, how does GSA know how much space agencies need? Does GSA have the funding and authority to pay expenses associated with closing offices, eliminating leases, and relocating agencies to new space? As GSA cuts its own budget and staff, who's going to do the labor-intensive work of terminating leases and relocating agencies? Is GSA going to hire contractors to replace federal employees? So Director Marroni and Mr. Winstead, I hope you can answer some of these questions. I don't expect you to be able to answer all those questions, but based on your experience, I hope we can get some insight into that. I look forward to your testimony and hope you'll be able to answer some of my questions. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I would now like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means conclude your remarks. I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Mr. Marroni, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Ezell, Ranking Member Stanton, and members of the subcommittee. I'm happy to be here today to discuss GAO's views on how to make federal real property work better for the American taxpayer. For more than 20 years, we've identified the management of federal real property as a high-risk area in need of substantial transformation. The federal government has held on to too much space and has been too slow in shedding unneeded properties. Federal buildings are often in poor condition and not well configured for the modern workplace, and the data needed to make good real property decisions has often been unreliable, in some cases non-existent. The pandemic shined a spotlight on these long-standing problems and created a unique opportunity to right-size the federal government's property holdings. There have been important actions in recent years to take advantage of these opportunities, but progress has been slow. Agencies have stayed in a wait-and-see mode for too long. Since January, there has been a notable shift in momentum. GSA is now rapidly moving forward with plans to terminate leases and dispose of large amounts of federal real property. As it does so, it's important that GSA and other agencies balance the goal of speedy reductions with the need for deliberate planning and analysis to help ensure the most effective result for the American taxpayer. There are a lot of moving parts right now that will shape federal real property for years to come. First, the Trump administration's return to office policy and its planned reductions in force are still early in their implementation. By summer, there will be clearer information on the size and shape of the federal workforce and what that means for real property needs. Secondly, under the Use It Act, agencies are now required to measure building utilization across their portfolios for the first time. As a result, by this summer, GSA and agencies will have important new data to inform long-term decisions on the federal real property portfolio. Third, it will take time and money to move out of one property and to consolidate into another. GSA and other agencies need to think through which reductions to prioritize and a funding strategy to implement those reductions in a way that makes the most sense. Gauging how much space is really needed under new workforce policies and then proceeding with reductions in a deliberate and planned out manner could generate substantial savings and mitigate the risk of mistakes and unexpected mission impacts. In conclusion, right-sizing the federal government's real property holdings is long overdue. As GSA and other agencies move forward with reductions, they should do so deliberately and in a strategic way that balances speed and thoughtful analysis and planning. Doing so will best position the federal government to achieve the most efficient and effective result for the American taxpayer, while ensuring agencies have the right space to successfully carry out their mission. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my opening remarks. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Marroni. Mr. Winstead, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Ezell, Ranking Member Stanton, Delegate Norton, who chaired the subcommittee when I was Public Building Commissioner, so good to see you again. I'm David Winstead, and I'm a member of the Public Building Reform Board. As I mentioned, I did have the pleasure of serving as Public Building Commissioner about 15 years ago. I wanted to thank this committee for creating this board, supporting its extension, which as a result, we're really realizing the potential to save billions of dollars for the federal taxpayer by recommending assets that are truly no longer needed to house federal employees and have value in terms of redevelopment on a local level. The board has independently analyzed 47 properties in a total of 35 million square feet. Our board is a very diverse board and very bipartisan board. Two former members of Congress, Nick Rahal and Mike Capiano, are members of the board. Myself, the former staff director of this subcommittee, and two major real estate executives that have holdings in New York City and around the country. And our strategy is really to right-size, help GSA and with working with OMB to right-size the portfolio. We're reviewing these targeted buildings under the FASTA authority based on reinvestment needs, occupancy levels, building significance, as well as the mission of that agency. Consolidation recommendations will be targeted towards higher quality federal buildings that Congress has appropriated funds for, that we've had the opportunity to reinvest and have a longer life cycle, and also the flexibility of leased options during the interim of transition. We are reaching out to every member of Congress in the districts where these assets lie. We're reaching out to the county commissioners and mayors of those jurisdictions as well. So we're doing that in preparation for our recommendations. As have been stated, the federal portfolio average age is over 50 years. And if you look at what they need in terms of renovation costs, most of these buildings that really have had deferred maintenance for decades would cost $700 to $1,000 per square foot to renovate. And so each year, GSA sees a deferral, if you will, of $2 billion of capital liability because they do not have the appropriated funds to invest in those buildings. The government really has two options. One is disposal of buildings that really are no longer needed. And secondly, provide for consolidation of employees in buildings that do have a life cycle that justifies their maintenance and reinvestment. There are really two groups of buildings in that category: pre-war properties and post-war properties. Very interestingly, as an aside, one of the top architects in the District of Columbia looked at some of the pre-air-conditioned historic buildings and said many of those lend themselves to housing renovation, reconversion, more than some of the post-last 50-year buildings. So we are really under our final review of looking at a series of assets. In the next round, we hope that we'll identify approximately $18 billion in cost avoidance over 30 years. The board found in 2023 that there was a 70% decrease in occupancy in these federal buildings. An example of that is the Department of Commerce, where if you count the number of federal employees in that building on an average daily basis, it's about $330,000 to house that federal employee. Another was the Department of Labor, $182,000 per year to house that employee. And we are therefore looking at properties in the district, primarily Miami, LA, Boston, and Atlanta, and we're doing outreach to those communities now. As an example of one of the recommendations that might be on our report, there's an older building in LA called the Wilshire Building, and it houses the FBI and the passport office. It is not seismically stable. They haven't had the money to renovate it. So we're looking at innovative ways to report that asset out and to have it redeveloped. UCLA is an adjoining landowner and needs expanded space, so there are opportunities there. So I would, just in conclusion, I did, with the testimony, put a list of some of the properties that we're currently evaluating. We anticipate we will have a report to Congress within a month or so, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that might come up when that report comes out. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both for your testimony. We will now turn to questions from the panel. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Now, question one, Mr. Marroni, to give some context, in 2023, you testified before this subcommittee detailing the results of GAO's review of the actual utilization of agency headquarters buildings here in Washington, D.C. At that time, you found that a majority of the buildings had a utilization rate of 25% or less, and some as low as 9%. Is that correct?
Yes.
Today, you point out that the federal government spends about $10.3 billion a year just maintaining and operating federal buildings. But that deferred maintenance has doubled from $170 billion in 2017 to $370 billion today. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Winstead, you mentioned in your testimony that the Department of Commerce headquarters in Washington, D.C. in 2023 cost the taxpayers an average of $322,428 per employee, and the Labor Department headquarters $182,346 per employee, compared to the average cost per person in the private sector being $9,600. This is a massive liability. To both of you, I'd like for both of you to try to answer, how did we get to this point, and how do we get this massive liability off the books and reduce the cost of federal real estate?
Sure. So this is a long-standing challenge. We've had this on our high-risk list for 20 years. Number of reasons how we got here. One would simply be agencies did not have an incentive to dispose of their real property. The funding needed, the upfront costs needed to consolidate, to move, to relocate is something that agencies often didn't have and would have come out of their mission. Other reasons include simply the age of the buildings. They've gotten older, they are created at a different time for a different workplace. These agencies and these buildings that no longer really fit their needs. And so huge buildings, smaller workforce, they don't need the same amount of space to do the work they did 50 years ago. And the end result is also deferred maintenance to these buildings. These buildings in many cases are not well maintained, in poor condition. And so what's the solution to that? One solution is targeting buildings that do have those high deferred maintenance backlogs and that are not well used. Those should definitely be top targets for disposal. That kills two birds with one stone. You're getting rid of some of your liabilities, and you're also getting rid of some underused space, then you can consolidate into more appropriate facilities.
Mr. Winstead, anything to add? Microphone.
The GSA portfolio is roughly 180 million square feet of owned and about the same of leased. And I think what all of us must recognize, the reality of the market and what happened during COVID, candidly. The onset of telework, which was 100% the early year of COVID, and then the adoption of new work practices did increase the number of people teleworking. Our law firm gave up 50% of its space between COVID and today, 2025, because more lawyers are working from home. And so what we're really dealing with is an aged inventory where we really got to focus on the best maintained core buildings that's worth the federal government and taxpayer to invest in. And then we've really got to look at backfilling space that is available. But the reality is, in the marketplace now, more people are teleworking, and that really vacated a lot of these buildings for the last 3 or 4 years.
As both of you know, Congress enacted significant federal real estate reforms as part of the 2024 WRDA, including the Use It Act. These reforms mandate that agencies either use their space or lose it. I understand, however, GAO and the Public Buildings Reform Board have both found challenges in how GSA sells properties. Can you discuss this issue to see and how GSA prepares and places properties up for sale? And is this process too bureaucratic?
So again, we've reported for years that this has been also a long-standing problem. Complicated process to dispose of a federal building. There's many steps to take. Those are policy choices ultimately to go through the public benefit conveyance system, to go through some of the statutory requirements that are in place now. So that's something Congress could certainly consider. Other parts of the disposal process also is how GSA puts the properties up for sale, what sales strategies it uses to dispose of properties. Typically, it defaults to an online auction site. That may not always be the best method to take. And putting up properties as is sometimes may not be the best approach either. Thinking about ways to make it clear to buyers what they would be getting so that you might have a barter market to put in sales offers.
Apologize. In terms of process of GSA, it's proven to be very, very lengthy and drawn out. We recommended 3 years ago 12 major assets for disposal, and GSA worked their way through them, and they're all but one is sold now. It's actually on the market. But it's a very protracted process. In the wisdom of Congress, they exempted our high-valued round from both Title V and public benefit conveyance. The assets we report out now are exempted from public benefit. So you really are able to streamline. You can't have a local government or other federal agency raise their hand for the assets we report out. So we feel strongly that our recommendations with the analysis that we've done around them will allow GSA to move much more expeditiously through the disposal process and really get rid of that property, return it to the tax roll for redevelopment and housing, affordable housing. So that's really what our report is targeted at, is making strong recommendations, both reporting to Congress about, our recommendations, but also to GSA. Candidly, I think many of the members of the board, 2 former members of Congress, are disappointed in some of the methods GSA has proceeded on. In reality, a public auction process is not monitored by the highest real estate interest and REITs and other investors in the country. They just don't look at a public auction site. So we're recommending to GSA, because of these complicated assets, some of the ones that we may report out here in the district are large, older buildings no longer needed, and there's a better way, more expeditious way to do it. And also, in our judgment, bring in advisory groups to help them determine highest and best use and get the best value back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Stanton for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In your statement, you made a strong case as to why we need to do this, why we need to improve efficiency in our public building utilization, and why we need to analyze that and dispose of buildings that are no longer needed. As we've made clear, that's exactly why we passed what we passed in the 2024 WRDA. That was done in an overwhelmingly bipartisan way. And we are improving those processes, and we're in agreement. We want to make sure that we get the highest and best use of those buildings, and those that are appropriate for public benefit, we utilize for public benefit. These are all things that we agree on in a bipartisan way. I guess the issue that we're dealing with right now is we're in the world of DOGE, and we're trying to figure out how DOGE overlays with the bipartisan policy that we passed through this committee. I mean, I think the theory of DOGE is move fast and break things, which may or may not work in certain instances, but disposing of public properties, there's a very good reason why we go through the process, and that's to make sure that we are protecting the taxpayers, that we get the most value of those buildings. So with that, I'm going to ask the question to Mr. Marroni. Return to work. Was GSA, as far as you know, consulted before the return to work executive order was signed by the president?
I do not know.
If the agency headcounts are in flux, how does GSA know how much space agencies need?
That's a challenge. It's important to know what your workforce is going to be.
It's the point I made at the beginning, which is unfortunate Mr. Peters is not here. GSA should be here answering these appropriate questions so that we can do our duty of oversight over the administration. Mr. Marroni, GSA does have a new public buildings commissioner, and soon after he took the position, he said, quote, "It is clear that the footprint of non-DOD federal buildings should be reduced by at least 50%. That's a pretty remarkable statement for being on the job for only a short period of time. How could the new commissioner possibly know that key information after only 4 days on the job?
I don't know. It does take some analysis to figure out what you need.
Have you personally seen any data that would lead you to determine that a 50% reduction was warranted?
We have not done that analysis.
Do you have, Mr. Winstead, do you have any idea, I'm kind of moving a different direction here, but it is important, it was listed as recently as yesterday as one of the items, I think it's been removed. It's moving a moving target about what's on the DOGE list, what's not on the DOGE list. Do you have any idea what the current administration's plans are for the FBI's headquarters?
Congressman, I do not. The House is, I do not. I can't speak for GSA. Obviously, there have been plans and actions in the past to move the FBI headquarters to Greenbelt, Maryland, I guess is recommendation. I do not know what the current status is.
Mr. Winstead, as you well know, based on your vast experience, not all federal space is the same. In addition to general office space, agencies have specialty spaces, science labs, warehouses, data centers, SCIFs, shooting ranges, and more. Should the federal government own should the federal government own specialty space and lease all-purpose office space, in your opinion?
Congressman, yes. When I was commissioner, specialized governmental space that has high security demands, FBI field office, federal courthouse, border stations, firing ranges, those are specialized uses that when I was commissioner and the Congress oversaw a budget, those were preserved and should be, in my judgment, preserved as federally owned space.
And many times a government agency that has long-term leases is going to make tenant improvements, major improvements, sometimes very specialized improvements because of the nature of the work that they do. Should the GSA dispose of lease space where the tenant agencies have made significant investments in tenant improvements, like holding cells, evidence rooms, counterintelligence equipment? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that in the decision about what the continued tenancy costs are, evaluating investment by that agency and the tenant fit-outs is very important. There are cases where specialized equipment has been paid for by the taxpayer through the agency's budget. And so a very careful analysis needs to be made to justify, moving an agency out of a, fully utilized more than 60% when there's specialized equipment. There are wonderful cases in maybe your district and elsewhere where they're lease facilities. A large part of the 32 field offices of the FBI were done under a lease construct process. So there you were leveraging private sector efficiency, but it is a lease space with specialized government use.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just reiterate that. It is so important that Mr. Peters appear before this subcommittee. I'm going to ask Chairman and Chairman Peters well to have another hearing as soon as possible so that we can get substantive answers on these very fair questions. A lot of angst associated with public buildings these days with return to work, termination, large-scale terminations, and the desire to sell off underutilized assets as quickly as possible. So GSA needs to be here ASAP. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Brashan. Brush your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't know if I heard a Barrett or a
No,
Bresnahan
just-
there. So, yesterday we found out that 3 federal buildings in my district are being considered for sale by the GSA and classified as non-core assets. 3 buildings. Roughly an hour ago, Bloomberg reported that the list of properties potentially for sale was taken off of GSA's website and the decision reversed. In my district, this list originally includes the Wilkes-Barre Federal Building, the Social Security Administration Data Operations Center in Plains Township, and a maintenance building in Wilkes-Barre. The Social Security Data Center employs nearly 1,400 workers, and I want to express my extreme frustration that I learned about this on the news, not from the GSA or the administration. Mr. Winstead, you had mentioned that you were going to be notifying members of Congress as to how the course of action would proceed. When was the member of Congress going to be notified that there could be implications to facilities inside of his district?
Congressman, the list that came out of GSA that has now been pulled off the website was, as I understand it, I'm not speaking for GSA, was a result of a long-term review by the portfolio office. That is distinguishable. We hope that more assets will come our way to be considered under the more expeditious sales process of FASTA. But we were not involved in that side of it. But I will tell you, it's very important in any asset that comes through FASTA that we're engaging broadly with the community and, and listening to both the agency need in that location as well as engage with the elected officials on the local, state, and federal level.
And I think that brings me to my next question, is some of our concerns is we need the PBRB and the GSA to ensure the sale would support our local communities and not become a strain. And I'm very familiar with these two different physical structures, but definitely have grave concerns when this is kind of a shell shock and we're sprung into action behind the eight ball. So obviously, I know you're not speaking on behalf of the GSA, but would welcome another conversation to make sure that we're all lockstep on what the future plans are for these buildings. My next question for Mr. Marroni, the Director of Physical Infrastructure, correct?
Correct.
You had mentioned in your testimony about some deferred maintenance costs on the facilities. Whose responsibility is that to make sure the buildings are maintained and adequately upkept to remain marketable?
So that's going to be GSA and the agencies depending on who has control of that facility.
Do they provide guidance, or does your office provide guidance? How does that work?
In terms of GSA has policies and procedures for that, and agencies that have control of that would as well, in terms of how they maintain facilities.
What's the most common form of deferred maintenance that you have observed?
I don't know if there's a most common I could point out. There's a range of things, everything from basic repairs to your elevators being out to major structural repairs. It depends on the building.
Back to Mr. Winstead. In your testimony, you've identified $19 billion in cost avoidance over 30 years on recommended properties to dispose of, approximately $633 million per year in federal savings. How does the annual cost savings compare to impacts on local economies and services like Head Start or other benefits within the community?
I think, Congressman, the assets that we report out are largely surplus and underutilized, right? So we're not talking about, it's not like the BRAC process. We're not talking about moving jobs. We're just talking literally about housing federal employees in better buildings, better workspace. So I think the real opportunity for the assets that we're looking at and will be reporting to Congress, number one, everybody will be notified and all their input will be considered. But it really is, we're trying to engage very, very much, not just with elected officials, but with the community in that area. For example, 40% of the GSA inventories in Washington, D.C. We reached out to Delegate Norton 2 years ago on this. We're talking to the mayor constantly, the director of planning for the district, the National Capital Park and Planning. So we're really trying to get everybody's involvement in what is the best option and what is the best redevelopment potential for those properties. So I really don't see a negative downside to this. These buildings, even with the return of federal employees, these buildings are no longer needed, basically. So how do you turn them back? What tools do the federal government, local government, the developer bring to the table to redevelop it with more vibrancy, better amenities, more housing, maybe some office space, probably not. And it goes on the local tax roll. One of the things the district is suffering from is a huge drop in property tax valuations right now. I mean, everybody is, most metropolitan areas are. So I think that, looking at the potential, we're actually, we're analyzing what is the highest and best use. It's a buyer that would take that through the process, but we're trying to get a handle on taking this asset or building. What is the best use and what's the value?
Thank you both for being here, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Ranking Member Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Winstead and Mr. Marroni, I will answer Representative Bresnahan's question about when are they planning to tell us? Never. And I think the process that we hope they use is one when they notify us sooner than never next time. And we passed this bill as part of the Water Resources Development Act and developed it in a bipartisan way under the leadership of Scott Perry, Representative Perry, so that there was a process, because we wanted to be very clear to GSA, we have too much space. They need to methodically look at the space, look at the numbers of people, and then make some decisions about what to keep and what not to keep. But as I noted in my opening statement, it seems that they instead of doing steps 1 through 5, the GSA just started at step 1 and jumped to step 5 of the Use It Act, and seems that that's where we are right now. But I do think that for Mr. Marroni, thinking about the law that we passed, it was part of WRDA. It's really not WRDA. It was a bill we tacked onto it. Can you talk to me about how, like, given what we put out, how many months would it have taken GSA to just kind of walk through that process to get to where GSA got overnight?
So under the Use It Act, within 6 months of the law passing, which was in January, so basically June, they would have needed to, agencies would need to start measuring their utilization. So that's a really key data point. So by summer.
By summer. And I don't know, it's not your job to answer this question, but it doesn't seem to me why we can't wait until summer for that. Because there's bipartisan support for that bill. It's not like they're racing against Congress catching up with them. We told GSA to do this. We want them to do this. And it seems like they're racing ahead to do something for some other reason, and I don't know what it is. But we have a process we put in place, just want them to use it. And then if we don't like the answer, shame on us, right, for passing the law. But that would be the answer. Can you talk to me a little bit about the 2019 relocation? I think you were asked to look at the moving of Department of Ag and Bureau of Land Management staff from DC to Kansas and Colorado. You studied that. Can you talk to us about, did that reduce cost? Did it attract highly qualified staff? What was your assessment of the move of those two parts to different parts of the country?
So I'm familiar with that report, not in
Okay.
detail. What I can say is that any relocation is going to involve real property costs. There's going to be transactional costs for the move. I would say there are other issues as well to consider in addition to real property, but we can certainly get back to you with information on that report.
You back specifically about that, just to learn some lessons. There might be some good reasons and some really bad reasons to move folks from or functions out of DC or back into DC as well. Mr. Winstead, if you could just answer for me, your first round of recommendations from the group was 47 properties, is that right?
Congressman, the first round was the 12 high-valued assets,
12
which
high-value assets.
have all been sold but for one in Palo Alto, which is now on the market.
Okay, and then what's the next step?
The next is the report we'll be sending to you, to Congress and OMB, and obviously working weekly with GSA of properties that are in the second round that we've analyzed. We've attached a page in my testimony that highlights some of the buildings that we've been analyzing. So these are the ones that are going to be addressed in that report.
And some of those buildings, if not all of those buildings, are on the list of 400 plus, the list that was put online and taken offline.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, but many others, right? These are only maybe 50 assets. So there are a lot of others that appeared on the list that GSA posted.
I'm talking about your list. The ones on your list are on the GSA list that was pulled off.
I assume so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I assume so because
They are, for the record, they are.
because we okay.
I cross it. Is that your last set of recommendations, or do you have another set of recommendations after this?
So then we have another round. So we'll be reporting this next round out within a month or so, and then we'll have another round at the end of 2026. Congress extended the board until the end of 2026. And I think what's significant about that, Congressman, is we really are seeing the impacts of telework. And obviously the directive of federal employees coming to the office, how many days a week will have an impact on that. But I think 2 more years will give us even more time to look at assets in more detail. And then in that last round, really recommend properties that are no longer needed. And we do have the authority.
Thanks. That's right. I'm right on time. I just want to just know, like, this spaghetti on the wall approach is just not working for the administration. But if they worked with the law that we passed, they work with you all, I mean, by the end of 2026, we will all have a fairly decent story to tell about the amount of leased space and owned space that we got rid of. It may not be what everyone wants, but we'll all be able to tell that story and make it a good story, and it'll line up with the numbers of people that we're expecting to come back into offices as well. It's flummoxing to me why there's this headlong rush from the GSA to do these things that they're having to pull back on anyway. We can help them do that. We're committed to the law we passed. So I would just note that and yield back.
Well, I do think that the word of,
I have to yield back, so yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the chair yields to himself 5 minutes. Mr. Marroni, the GAO's 2023 report found that 17 of 24 agency headquarters buildings were operating at 25% or less capacity. What structural or bureaucratic barriers do we have that prevent agencies from consolidating or relinquishing underutilized spaces?
I mean, in terms of consolidation, the main factor is just having the planning and the funding to do it. Agencies could consolidate. It does take time, it does take money, but they could consolidate.
Right. And the Office of Management and Budget has prohibited GSA from negotiating discounted purchases on leases, often forcing government to pay more over time. What impact has this had on long-term costs, and how could that be changed to save the taxpayers?
I didn't hear the first part.
Yeah, the first part, OMB has prohibited the GSA from negotiating discounted purchases on buildings. And often that forces the government to pay more than they might have otherwise. How could that be addressed?
So how it could be addressed if it's a policy, I'm not familiar with that specific policy,
Okay.
but if it's a policy, it could be addressed by Congress through law or by OMB.
Got it, okay. And, it's, okay. And then the Utilizing Space Efficiency and Improving Technologies Act, the USED Act, mandates a 60% occupancy threshold for federal buildings. How can Congress ensure that agencies comply with that requirement?
Right. Well, I think an important role for this subcommittee in itself is holding hearings, holding oversight with GSA and the other relevant agencies to make sure that they are following through on what's required by statute.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Winstead, you mentioned the board's analysis, that the board's analysis had saved $19 billion in cost avoidance over 30 years. Can you walk us through those savings and what factors contributed the most to those savings?
Congressman, what we have done with the assets, some of which appear on the last page, is we've gone in basically assessing what the deferred maintenance has been, and we've analyzed what is needed. If the government decided to keep that building, what would it take to reinvest it, to bring it up to workspace that the federal employee, can function? So that's how we're doing. We're looking at basically the condition of the building, the utilization of the building, deferred maintenance in the building, and if those judgments say keep the building, then what's needed to be appropriated by Congress to the Public Building Fund to bring that building up to standard. And obviously, part of this is backfilling the buildings. I think Congress has been very, in the recent legislation, said 60% utilization, data every year on what's being done in these buildings, housing plans from each federal agency in terms of how they're using the space, how many employees are there. But the other thing that needs to be done is the communication of the bottom line of our reports from GSA have to reach the top levels of federal agencies. It's got to really a decision, because some of the things we're looking at are underutilized federal buildings here in DC, some of which have agencies' names on them. And they're no longer justified to be maintained, so convincing that secretary, assistant secretary of administration, that it's in the best interest of the taxpayer for them to move into another federal building that's better maintained and sell that building for redevelopment. So that's the analysis, and we have a lot of analysis of the committee, all these assets, when we have been totally analyzed, and we can send that to the committee as well, how we've calculated those costs and that have backed up our decision to surplus the building.
Thank you. I yield back. Ms. Norton is recognized for 5 minutes.
I strongly oppose OMB and OPM's recent decision to federal agencies to, quote, propose relocations of agency bureaus and offices from Washington, D.C. and the National Capital Region to less likely parts of the country, end quote. I also strongly oppose the many bills that have been introduced this Congress to relocate the headquarters for federal agencies in the National Capital Region to outside the National Capital Region. These relocations, as we saw during the first Trump administration, would harm the operations of these agencies and waste taxpayer dollars. They would also harm the economy of the National Capital Region. On Monday, I introduced a bill to prohibit such relocations. However, there are specific federal buildings in D.C. the GSA should dispose of and move the employees from those buildings into other buildings in D.C. These disposals would save the federal government money, generate tax revenue for D.C., increase housing supply in D.C., and create new mixed-use neighborhoods in D.C. Congress has passed many of my bipartisan bills to transfer unused and underutilized federal buildings and land in D.C. to the D.C. government or the private sector, including the Webster School with Chairman Perry, what became the Wharf, and the Yards, and most recently the RFK Stadium campus. I first introduced a bill in 2014 to facilitate the redevelopment of the Southwest Federal Center into a mixed-use neighborhood. Mr. Winstead, please discuss the opportunity to dispose of federal buildings in the Southwest Federal Center to create a new mixed-use neighborhood and connect the National Mall and the Wharf.
Delegate Norton, as you know, because it's in the report and we've briefed you, there are a number of buildings that are, Forrestal Building is the building right on L'Enfant Plaza, but there's the Witten Building, the Agriculture South, that many of the people that have looked at it that are still very underutilized, and a lot of the NCPC, the mayor's office, your office, and Department of Planning for the district have looked at it, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to basically begin, as many people view it, opening up the mall to the waterfront. The Forrestal Building is one of those where it's costing $130,000 a year to house the federal employees that show up. If you were able to take down the Forrestal Building, it would develop, there'd be 4 parcels, there are ways to develop it for affordable housing, for mixed use, for amenities. But one of the visions that architect at SOM has is it would really create a connection between the mall and the waterfront. He described it as sort of the Spanish Steps of Washington, D.C. You would get out the end of L'Enfant Plaza and you could go down the steps and get over to the waterfront. So these are some of the visions that are options, if you will, that need to be studied carefully by the Department of Planning for the district, by NCPC, but that's happening. ULI has advised our board on some of these options. So I think it's, in that case, it's very exciting. You're taking grossly underutilized buildings. There are other opportunities to redevelop them if they're historic. One of the buildings in Southwest has already opened as a residential building. It was an historic building. So I think that there's some great opportunities. We're working closely with all the players in the district in terms of what the impact of surplusing these properties are. Number one, the timing of them. There is concern generally that we don't want to, all these assets shouldn't come on the market at one time. They should be reported out, but maybe a phasing. Southwest assets I've just mentioned near agriculture are a first phase in my judgment. But so I think I think some very exciting things that people are envisioning. We have developers that have advised through ULI and NCPC, and I think your staff's probably seen those reports.
Mr. Weinstein, how would the disposed of federal buildings in the Southwest Center positively impact federal taxpayers and the federal government?
Well, the board makes its recommendations to GSA, and their disposal division is the one that handle them. But we have in the past and will continue to make very specific recommendations of how they could be surplused and sold for redevelopment in a phased way. The other thing the board, seeing as we have a couple of major real estate people, just understanding what the highest and best use of that asset is. Really saying, what is it? Is it some residential? Is it some museums for the Smithsonian? In terms of the Forrestal Building, it's adjacent to the Smithsonian. So, and how do you phase it? What should be brought to the market first? We'll be working closely with Director of Planning in the district and others to try to help and support that. It's really their actions. Our report and our action is really reporting them out. But we're looking at phasing. We're looking at engaging users, investors, and getting their best ideas.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know that there could be a more potent symbol of government waste and inefficiency than the spectacle of federal office buildings just sitting there empty with taxpayers footing the bill. I'm seeing that GSA manages more than 8,300 owned and leased assets totaling over 365 million square feet. That's easy to remember. It's 1 million square feet for every day of the year. That the cost of operating, maintaining, and leasing office space costs $8 billion annually. And yet, a report last year showed an occupancy rate, an average building occupancy rate of just 12%. 12%. So it's interesting because we have this emergent set of talking points here in the Capitol among some that no, the federal government is perfect, there's no need to modernize it, no need to scale it back, no need to improve efficiency in the use of taxpayer resources. And then you can view alongside that sentiment this picture of all these federal buildings just sitting there being paid for with no one in them. We even have reports of shadow or dark space in federal buildings and leases, which are just not used at all and not even assigned, simply just sitting there. This is something that American taxpayers have every right to be outraged about. And I think that, Mr. Winstead, you put sort of a cost per employee on office space for some departments. Would you mind repeating those numbers? I believe it was in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, Congressman, we, in our report in March of last year, there was data in it that showed, based on the occupancy, as you suggest, 20% or average of 20%, what is the cost to GSA of maintaining that building per employee? And it varied from Commerce, 160, to Department of Energy, 130, but it's totally unjustified.
That's per employee that's actually present, or per just employee?
That show up.
That show
Per
up.
employee that show up versus per day during the course of the year.
Because for everyone that shows up, 4 don't show up, is what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, in a private sector office building, the cost of an employee space is about $10,000 a year.
Interesting.
So
the average cost is over 10 times higher for the government than for the private sector.
Yeah, more than that. And again, you know, it's an impact of COVID. It's an impact of telework policy and work habits since telework happened. It's obviously an impact of OPM and their directive in terms of federal employees' presence in office. But it really has, the last 2 or 3, 4 years since we've been looking at this, it's really gotten worse, right, in terms of the utilization.
I mean, that's fascinating because even the private sector has had, underutilization issues. And you're saying even given that, we're paying 10 times more per employee than they are in the private sector.
In the instance of those buildings, at the
Right.
time we looked at
When you did the
utilization
survey.
versus the cost the GSA pays to maintain that building per year, yes, it's over 10 times.
I also found it interesting that the GAO has noted that agencies are reluctant to share their headquarters with other agencies, and they cite a lack of mission alignment, which is a little hard for me to understand because, after all, these are all agencies that are serving Americans, are part of the federal government. That seems like enough of a mission alignment. But even if there was none whatsoever, I walk into business buildings all the time that have completely unrelated businesses working next to each other. But also, maybe it would be good if the agencies were talking to each other a little more. One of the problems that we have in our bureaucracy is that things are so siloed. So you get an approval from this agency, but then you're waiting years to get one for this agency, or you ask this agency to get the approval, and they said they need to wait for that agency, and apparently they have no way to talk to each other and coordinate. So maybe if they could pick up the paper and walk it across the hall to someone down the hall, that might make the federal government work better together a little bit. So what do you think, Mr. Marroni? Is there something to be said for trying to get agencies under the same roof?
Oh, definitely. Agencies, that reluctance is not acceptable.
Thank you very much. Hopefully that's something that we can work on, and I think that we can not only save taxpayers a lot of money, but send a message about the newfound paradigm of efficiency and modernization that we're trying to usher in at the federal level. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. McDonald-Rivet, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to put these pieces together when we're talking about data collection. And so very clearly, we have to be the best stewards of taxpayer dollars, and we should not be paying for space that is not utilized. We should not be paying for buildings that have very low occupancy. What I'm a little concerned about, so Mr. Winstead, you talked about the data that you've been collecting and the work that you've been doing, which sounds excellent, by the way, with the impact of telework. But we're seeing return to work. We're seeing telework ended very abruptly. And just this week, we're starting to see reports in the news that are talking about the messiness of that due to poor planning. We've got workers showing up in places where there's no desks, no Wi-Fi, no lights, and there's a lot of chaos that's happening right now. So I'm really encouraged, Mr. Marroni, when you were talking about the collection of data, that we should be able to have something solid to work from. But when I think about the data that you are both talking about over the last several years, as well as what's being collected right now, when we've got mass chaos on the return to work policy, how isn't the data you're collecting now going to be somewhat invalid 2-3 months from now? Isn't there a place where, in the best interest of efficiency and saving taxpayer dollars, we want to be logical and methodical in this? What validity will your data have this summer with so much chaos in the landscape right now?
You need good data to make good decisions. That's been a problem in real property for a long time. And with the Use It Act, there is a chance to have utilization data for the first time. When we did our study in 2023, we could only really do headquarters buildings because once you get outside of the National Capital Region, that data really didn't exist. So the Use It Act is a really important step to both set benchmarks and get the kind of data you're describing. And that data is really important if you're deciding what buildings to dispose of, because understanding the utilization profile is really essential in addition to knowing how many people are going to be coming into those buildings.
Of course, no argument here. My question is around the data collection. So as we are seeing a little bit of a hiccup around this return to work, how are those data collected? And in what timeline? So can you really count utilization if people are in offices where there are no lights or no Wi-Fi as we try to work through this?
So under the law, agencies will be required to at least use badging data, swipe data. So understanding the problems you're highlighting for people working in those spaces if they don't
I'm
have
sorry,
them.
sir, but over what time period?
Pardon?
Over what time period?
Over what time period? The badging data, I believe they're required to start measuring in 6 months, so June, summer.
They start measuring in June?
Yeah, they have to start measuring in June and use at least badge swipe data. They can use other technologies as well. That's part of the law. But badge swipe data would allow you, if someone's coming into the building, regardless of the quality of the workspace they're in, it would give you a sense of how many people are coming into the building.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Figures, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Marroni, I think most of my questions will be for you. And I just want some clarity because I'm down in Mobile, Alabama. That's where I'm from. My district covers a few other cities, including Montgomery, Alabama. But we hear through media reports of different facilities being identified. Some are on the DOJ list, some are not on the website. And so in hopes of getting some clarity around the process, how these decisions are being made. I'm hoping that we can get some understanding here. Do you personally communicate with anybody on the DOGE team?
With personally communicate with DOGE, we have not.
Oh, is that just for you and your component office, or is that for the entire organization?
So GA, I know, has had some limited interactions with DOGE, but in our overall work, most of our work is with GSA, since they are the action on federal property.
Got it. But during the GSA process for acquisition, you guys are in contact with GSA?
For any of our audit work that's on federal property, we're almost certainly going to be in contact with GSA.
And before the DOGE process, did you guys have a role in the, let's call it, getting rid of any physical property?
So our role is to investigate and look at ways to do disposals more effectively and efficiently, just overall government operations more effectively and efficiently. So we have been involved over the years in looking at this challenge of underused space, of how to dispose of that property and right-size real property holdings, but as an independent auditor, not as involved in the decision-making process.
Got it. But you guys have that expertise and that
We do have that
background in
expertise.
terms of investigating. Yet you guys are not being consulted in the process currently.
No, although we typically would not be. We're not involved in executive branch decision-making, so we ask questions based on our audit objectives, and we want information back on those questions, but we aren't involved in the decision-making process.
Absolutely. And Mr. Winstead, I do have one for you as well. As we're making these, my concern is that these decisions are being made so fast, and I'm in, I think, the same boat as everybody. I don't think anybody wants us to be sitting on unused real estate and paying for it. But I get the feeling that these decisions are being made so fast and so just in such a rush that there is not sufficient investigation going on or sufficient collaboration going on in terms of what are the long-term needs or what are the possible needs of leases that we're terminating. And I'm also, we're getting reports that DOGE is saying that they terminated leases that were terminated months ago, if not years ago, before the Trump administration came in. And so it just leads me to being very concerned about communication and streamlined communication as the decision-making process is going forward with which leases to terminate. Again, if we don't need it, we should terminate it. But can you talk to us a little bit about the suggestions that you would provide in terms of making sure that the decision process is being as informed as it can possibly be?
Sure. Congressman, so with the assets that I referred to in this report and that we're really examining and have been, we've done it over a longer period of time, and this isn't something that's just happened. We've really been looking at it for 2.5 years. And our engagement with the administration is both directly with the commissioner on a weekly basis and also OMB on not a weekly, but a regular basis in terms of what we're finding, in terms of the sustainability of that building and the lack of need for it over the long term, and then so that our recommendations are fully vetted with the agency and that their review, GSA's independent review of their portfolio, can consider what we're looking at in the assets that we've targeted as the highest value, the grossly, most of them totally unutilized, and the best return to that host jurisdiction in terms of redeveloping that property for generation. It goes on the local tax roll. It creates new construction jobs and that kind of thing. So we are very much engaged coordinating with the Commissioner of Public Buildings, Mike Peters, his team, and also the new OMB people that are overseeing GSA.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield back. Or Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
The chairman recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. I was watching my television and I saw Mr. Stanton asking questions about this issue, and it's something that concerns me because I was informed by my staff yesterday that they got some Bloomberg report that showed that the GSA and Mr. Genius from South Africa was proposing closing the Memphis Federal Building, which contains our courthouse, our U.S. Attorney, our U.S. Marshals, the Corps of Engineers, probation office, and my office. So it came as a bit as a shock to me. I knew some of the judges had been trying to find a new building for Memphis to have a courthouse. I don't think we're very high up on the prospective courthouse list, and it seems like we should at least be on the list for a new courthouse before they get rid of the courthouse we're in. The federal building we have now is 98% occupied. The judges claim that there's a lot of problems in the building, and they have shown me pictures of the vents with lots of black gook in it and whatever. They tote those around with them like some Hugh Hefner probably would have carried centerfolds. And it's pretty strange, but that's what they do. I have no problem with the federal building. I've been there for 18 plus years and have never had a problem. They say they might have a problem with security and that the elevators could take prisoners up and down and from holding tanks to court. There's never been a prisoner, I think, ever escape or ever try to escape in 35, 40 years. All of a sudden, oh, we've got to have a new building. Do either of y'all know anything about the Memphis federal building and how it got put on the list and what the story is?
No, not me.
Congressman, I do not know what the current review by GSA is on that property. I will tell you that GSA, from my background 15 years ago, you know, the federal courthouses and the mixed tenanted federal courthouses where there's a lot of the renovation that's been driven was really to improve the security in that courthouse in terms of the flow between the visitors, the members of the jury, the judges, and the defendants. And so GSA put in billions of dollars over the last 15 years upgrading courthouses. I don't know the Memphis specifically. I haven't had the pleasure of going there, but there could be some issues there about the value of maintaining and renovating that building versus, you know, a new courthouse. That's the only thing I can. But, you know, at 95% occupancy, I mean, that's a utilized building.
Right.
I mean, that's highly utilized, so it's not on the parameters that the committee and the new legislation directs that, you know, it's higher than 60%. But there could be some rationale about the safety of that building because of the court function and the need to separate. The older courthouses do not have the separation that the newer courthouses do. So,
yeah. Well, it's more difficult to get into the building with the security we have and the limited entries they have now than it would be to get into Charlie Palmer's giving steak away. Charlie Palmer's isn't here anymore, Capitol Grill or whatever. So y'all, I was just shocked, and I guess, I don't know if GSA is out there listening. GSA, if you're listening, please find the tapes, the letters, it was the letters, the emails, yeah. But I imagine they're listening. The congressman has more to do with that building than the judges. The judges have, I don't know how they found the time to spend all this time trying to find a new building when they've got all these cases to deal with. But it seems like if they're going to sell a building and they got to have a buyer, and there hasn't been a lot of buyers for buildings in that neighborhood recently, but they should at least have a place to put the courts and the other offices that are housed there now before they decide they're going to sell the building and tear it down.
absolutely, and I'm sure GSA is monitoring this, so I know that they'll get back to you.
Thank you, GSA. My name is Steve Cohen, C-O-H-E-N. I'm on the third floor of the Odell Horton building, which I had named for Odell Horton, a famous and jurist, an African-American jurist, and named for him because he is an inspiring figure for young people that want to go into the law. And he was a great judge and a great prosecutor and African-American, and don't tear him down. Thank you, GSA.
The chair recognizes the gentle lady from New Jersey, Ms. Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our ranking member Stanton for letting me to participate in this very important meeting, and especially what a timely hearing it is. I want to ask our witnesses if you would please turn around and see if do you know the man who's in that portrait right there that I'm pointing to? So let me just tell you who he is. He is Robert Rowe, one of my predecessors in Congress. Bob Rowe was the chairman of this committee. Then it was called the Public Works Committee. I ask because Bob Rowe's name adorns the federal building in my home city of Paterson. The same federal building we just learned just today is on a list of 440 properties to be disposed by the Trump administration. The IRS and the Social Security office have public office facing there at this very moment, serving the people of the third largest city in the state of New Jersey and all of our other neighboring towns. The lines to access needed services form very early in the morning. The Rowe Building is a critical resource for our community. Just last year in October, the GSA awarded a contract for $5.8 million, courtesy of the Inflation Reduction Act, for the much-needed renovations and repair. So now, less than 6 months later, the proposed sale of the Rowe Building strikes me as totally nonsensical. And I will vigorously, as you can see, will indeed oppose this. So I want to ask, and I want to start with Mr. Winstead. Can you please explain to me and to this body here how the list of the buildings to be sold was compiled? And can you explain the Trump government's criteria and rationale?
Congresswoman, that building, the Rowe Building, is not on the list that our board is looking at. It was issued on a list that came out, I think, Tuesday.
Right.
And then was withdrawn. I think, again, I think that GSA will fully get in touch with you on that, and I'll obviously convey that as well. But so that list was withdrawn, I think, last night.
So let me just say, well, first of all, I'm very happy to hear that. But to be honest with you, for us to be hearing, I know one of my fellow colleagues spoke about it just before I did, to hear that these lists or these properties, to hear from the public, which is how I actually learned about it, because it was in the newspaper, not because anyone notified. And the fact that if it was in fact withdrawn, we get absolutely no notification and information. So I really believe, Mr. Chairman, and to our two folks that are here today presenting testimony, we really have to have a better line of communication so that we can avoid these things from happening. I'm very happy to hear that. I look forward to GSA communicating with my office to letting us know what is the real status. Believe me when I tell you, when we are dealing with one of the most highly needed, and I listened very carefully to your point earlier when you were mentioning a response that it is based on the highest and best use of the building. There could be no better use for that building than for the use of making sure that they are providing the much needed services to the people of our district, and they are doing their job. So I'm going to just be looking out for that, and thank you so very much for your comment. So I'll be looking out for that. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there further questions from any of the members of the subcommittee who have not yet been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for the day. I would like to thank all of the witnesses who appeared before us today. The subcommittee stands adjourned.